Hello, this is Jade Marie from my channel, Jade's Jewels. I wanted to take a minute to thank you all for tuning in. And again, as you can see in the title, what I'm doing is a series on systemic racism. And I'm basically doing this because I wanted to take the opportunity to educate people of all backgrounds on how systemic racism works. I think that oftentimes we kind of get caught up in a different narrative and a different rhetoric surrounding Black and brown people, but particularly African Americans. And what we want to do is oftentimes we stereotype them, but we don't realize how systemic racism, particularly the laws that have been voted in through the House and through the Senate, through the history of our country, has affected Black people, okay, African American people. So if you don't mind, take a minute to like, share, and subscribe. This is going to be an awesome video. I'm not going to try to make this too lengthy. What I'll do is probably each video I will maybe talk about 2 or 3 laws that occurred in history and how it affects African American people and just other segments of history, just to kind of give people a better basis of what African Americans have had to go through. And the reason why I want to do this is because I have friends of all backgrounds, and they've been super supportive. They've checked on me during this time, particularly around Breonna Taylor's death, as well as George Floyd's death, which was definitely one of the straws that essentially has broken the camel's back in terms of racism, overt racism. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to lay a groundwork to really help people understand what Black people have gone through in this country. I am actually from Mississippi. My lineage comes from Mississippi as well as from Arkansas, Mississippi, and we both know the history that these two states have had in terms of racism. But with that, what I wanted to do was just try to help people understand, because sometimes when we think about racism, particularly now, lots of my friends, they're like, oh no, I'm not racist. And of course, I don't think that they are. However, racism and that racial lens that perpetuates racism, I truly believe is a generational curse. And just like any other generational curse or any type of shadow work that we do, shadow work deals with looking at systems that you have, mindsets that you have that do not serve who you are at the present time. And sometimes these mindsets and these perspectives have been shaped from our parents. Sometimes they've been shaped from experiences, but sometimes they've just been shaped from information that we've been given as a child. And so again, today I'm going to talk about 2 laws. I really hope that you all enjoy this video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And again, it's me, Jade Marie. So let's take a look at some things. This is one of the first laws I wanted to talk about. It's essentially the GI Bill, but not the GI Bill as we know it right now in 2020. This is the GI Bill that we know from 1944, and I do have my notes, but from 1944. And originally this act was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. It was signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And if anyone knows anything about FDR, I'm positive that he was a great leader. I was not around at that time, but a lot of his laws supported white supremacy. It supported the upliftment of white people, and what it did not do was it did very little for Black people. And at that time, the country was more of a white versus Black. We did have other nationalities, and I'm not discounting any other race of people, but particularly at that time, it was a big deal with whites versus Black. And as I go into this law, we'll kind of get into that. But this law, the GI Bill, what it did was it provided wonderful, amazing benefits to individuals who had either done 120 days of active duty serving in the war at that time or in any type of post position. And also, either you served 120 days or you were discharged with an honorable discharge. So essentially, if you hit one or two of those criteria, regardless of the color of your skin, you were you were allowed to take advantage of these benefits. These benefits included so many wonderful things: a low cost mortgage. It helped individuals go back to high school. It helped a lot of the men go to vocational school. It also paid for tuition as well as living expenses for those individuals who elected to go to college. Their college was essentially paid for. Not only that, it also provided low cost entrepreneurial loans to many of the men that maybe they didn't feel like college was a fit for them, but now maybe they had learned something in terms of a vocational skill and they wanted to own their own business. And so these loans and these benefits oftentimes went to, again, veterans who had served in the war. However, when we take a look at history and who was truly able to take advantage of these benefits, when we take a deeper dive, we really look and see how these benefits did not, and they were not, provided to African American people at at a pinch of the scale that they were provided to our white counterparts. And again, I'm not a white versus black person, but right now what I'm doing is I'm talking about facts. These are just facts, okay? So when I look at people, I see a person. I know what color they are, but I just want to throw that out there for anyone who, wants to kind of get a little sassy. Um, this is not necessarily about white versus black, but this does show how the segregation of benefits that were provided to whites versus blacks. Okay, these benefits enabling white men to purchase homes at low cost mortgages, to gain further skills through vocational and high school, as well as to actually have access to college education that they themselves did not have to come out of their pocket and pay for. This really created a lot of the economic growth that we saw within the white community at that time. It stimulated long-term growth, generational wealth that the white community has been able to, and they still reap the benefits from this law that was signed in 1944. This is the year of 2020, and so what is it, about 76 years ago? 76 years ago. So for 76 years, our white counterparts have been able to continue to grow and hand down some of the benefits that came from this law. The one group that was disenfranchised and did not have the advantage of taking on the benefits of this law were African American men who also fought in the war, who were oftentimes on the front line, who also served their country. So here we have men who served their country, who were supposed to come back and receive benefits to help them readjust to civilian life. And when we just look at history, we see that black men did not have the opportunity to take advantage of these benefits. For example, mortgages were many times denied to African American people in this country, even the ones who were supposed to be able to have that VA benefit. They did not receive that GI benefit. They were denied mortgages. Essentially, what happened was they were denied these low cost mortgages as well as business loans and even the education. But essentially, what banks would do was they would say, well, we can't insure this mortgage because an African American person is going to live in this home, or this home is in an African American neighborhood or near an African American neighborhood. And so that makes this type of loan risky. Therefore, we can't underwrite the loan, or therefore we can't even provide the loan or the insurance to cover this loan because it's being provided to an African American individual. And so here, within this period in time in our country, we see where white men are able to achieve home ownership, which is a huge part of what we consider to be the American dream. They were able to obtain this home ownership very easily, not because they had worked hard, because I know a lot of there's rhetoric amongst the white community that says, I'm not a racist, I've worked hard for everything that I've been given. But we're going to kind of take a look at what that really looks like. But you have men, they did work hard, they served their country. But what I mean by that is they didn't save $10,000 to pay down on their home. Many of these men went to the army. This is white and black men. Many of these men went to the army, number one, because there was a draft. But number two, because our country was going through a Great Depression. And so the opportunities to earn money and the economic opportunities to actually have a job, they just weren't there. And so another option for them to earn income was to join the army. And so many men joined the army. However, when we look at men that were discharged, there's a huge disparity in the amount of men, African American men, that were able to obtain these low cost mortgages. In history, there were about 67,000 in one particular city. There are about 67,000 mortgages that were given to white men. Of those 67,000 mortgages that were made to white men, fewer than 100 were made to black men. It was just that tough for black men to take advantage of these benefits. And so we really have to look at that, because we know that home ownership leads to generational wealth. And think about it this way. Home ownership, they were purchasing these homes maybe for $25,000, $15,000. And then 20, 30, 40 years down the line, their homes are worth $400,000, $300,000, $500,000. And so what basically happened was, after these individuals purchased their mortgage, when their children were older, they were able to access the equity in their home to help their children pay for college, or to help their children purchase a business and things of that nature. Well, whereas on the other hand, African American men did not have the opportunity. Again, entrepreneurial loans for a black man in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. If you just look at history, you will not see nearly the amount of approved loans made to a black man, whether it be for his business or for the purchase of a home for his family at that particular time, versus that of a white man. Also, when you really take a look at that one law, you can begin to see how disparities were created, how lines of division were created. White men could access the GI Bill to establish home ownership, which does give access to generational wealth. Some of the rules or the guidelines in terms of purchasing these homes were that these homes could not be close, not only to a black neighborhood, but not even close to a black resident. Okay, so you were able to purchase these homes in suburbs outside of the city, or just anywhere where African Americans were not prevalent, or technically not even allowed. And this was also supported by the banking industry as well. So banks did not, at that particular time, banks did not believe in making mortgage loans to African Americans. They created a thought in their head that then became a guideline in terms of, if your home is near African American, then your neighborhood is risky, or that puts your home at a greater risk, which we consider that loan to be risky. So if you purchase a home near white people, you're approved. If you purchase a home near African American individuals, it's very clear your loan will not be approved. And this was even the same for African American men. The very few men who were able to take advantage, particularly of these low cost mortgages, they were not even supported in terms of really trying to purchase in their neighborhoods. It was just so much red tape the African American men had to go through to access these benefits. And so I definitely encourage anyone to look into the disparities of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. Those disparities were wide, as well as the effects of those disparities are still seen today. And so we really have to take a look at these things when we make comments like, you should pull yourself up by your bootstrap. Well, if we were given the same boots, or if the men of that time were given the same boots, the same opportunities, we would not see the amount of poverty, the amount of just so many things, that even crime that goes on within the Black community. We would not see that. And so that's just the Servicemen's Act. And we know at that time, a large percentage of the population did go off to fight in the war. Now, that was in 1944. Long before then, in 1934, there was the National Housing Act of 1944. And this was a part of the New Deal. And the New Deal was kind of one of the ways, or one of the acts that were put in place to kind of combat the effects that had been seen around the Great Depression. And so this was saying, hey, we want to help low income families, particularly white low income families. We want to help them to reestablish themselves. And so that's kind of what the New Deal was all about. But what the New Deal did, and what the National Housing Act of 1934 did, was it specifically created redlining. Red. But redlining, and anyone who knows the history of redlining knows the just, you know, I tell people all the time, African American people did not voluntarily say, hey, we want to live in the quote unquote in the ghetto. Because we're just being honest here. Ghettos were created for African American people. That was where the areas that we were pushed into. And we won't even call them ghettos. We'll just call them Black neighborhoods. But essentially, they were neighborhoods that did not have nearly the amount of resources that their white counterparts did. And so this is where we really see, even going back as far as 1934. So now that is what, about an 86-year difference. So we talked about what occurred about 76 years ago. Now we're going back about 86 years ago. So this is around the time when, not for some of you, but for me, this is when my grandparents were living. For some of you all, it may be your great grandparents, and some it may be your great great grandparents. But for me, this is around the time when either my grandparents were, I'll be completely honest with you, my grandparents were living. One of them may have been younger, but my grandparents were living during this time, okay? And so we particularly see within, again, the national, so this is the United States, this is the National Housing Act of 1934. It created redlining to basically say that people who don't look alike should not live in the same neighborhood. So when you think about how these effects are still playing out to this day, in terms of schools, we see schools where the neighborhoods, many of these neighborhoods in In certain school districts, they have more renters, they have lower average incomes, um, they have lower resources. And then we see other neighborhoods in more suburban areas. These schools have a magnitude of resources. The median income is particularly higher. And when we look at that, it's not because these people are white, it's because there have been laws put in place. So that's when we're talking about systemic things. There have been systemic laws put in place to uplift white people, and on the other hand, there have been systemic laws put in place to disenfranchise African American individuals. And so redlining for the mortgage companies, basically what they said was, if it's in a black neighborhood, it's too risky, we're not going to insure it. Maybe we'll provide, maybe. Oftentimes they did not provide loans, so let's just be completely honest. Oftentimes they did not provide mortgage loans for these African American individuals. However, when they did provide these mortgage loans, these loans were not insured, they were higher risk. Oftentimes African Americans paid particularly more for a house than their white counterpart did. And the house could have had the same square footage and the same type of amenities. Before African American family, that home may have cost them $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 more, which at that time was quite a bit of money. And so from the National Housing Act in 1934, which really kind of created the foundation of redlining, we have the FHA, which is the Federal Housing Act, that was also established in 1934. And what this did was it refused, this act refused to insure those mortgages, just as I said, for African American and African American neighborhoods. But now this is what it also did. So not only did we stop African American people, or we created large barriers. The government created large barriers for African Americans to purchase homes. On the other hand, what they did was they subsidized the development of white neighborhoods in suburban areas. So they subsidized the developers in developing these areas, and then they also subsidize the mortgages for white people to gain access to these homes. Okay, and so we really have to look at that. On one hand, we're doing everything we can to stop a particular group of people because of the color of their skin, and then on the other hand, we're actively helping another group to gain access to home ownership. So we really have to take a look at the history of our country. You know, people want to say racism doesn't exist, or black people need to do better, or, you know, they choose to live in these neighborhoods. I mean, well, if you really look at the history of it, we didn't have anywhere else to live. We weren't given the same opportunities. And that's a part of the rhetoric that really has to be debunked. We always want to say, well, I went to school, they went to school. I had this, they had that. But when we really look at it, that playing field was never ever even. And so we really have to think about those things. So again, housing was subsidized, okay, for white people to move into suburban areas slightly outside of their city. And here's the thing, for them to gain access, white people, for them to gain access, Anglos, okay, Caucasians, for them to gain access to these mortgages, for you all, because I'm really hoping that this video reaches whites as well as blacks, but for you all to gain access to these mortgages, the number one thing was that these homes could not be near an African American home, near an African American resident. And this has had a lasting effect. Even with some of the developers that were subsidized by the government to create these neighborhoods and these subdivisions, they were required, if it was relatively maybe a couple of miles away from an African American neighborhood, they had to build a 6-foot cement wall. Okay, a wall. And you know, when we just hear the word build a wall, we automatically think about 45, and we know why. Why is a wall so important? Why is it that whiteness has to be so guarded and so protected, but blackness has to be disenfranchised and disadvantaged? And again, these are laws that were signed into place. So this isn't opinion, these are facts. Okay, so then you have the Homeowners Loan Corporation that started in 1933. So 77 years ago. It was started, and this is where redlining kind of really begins. It started with the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1933. It was then handed down to the Federal Housing Act and the Federal Housing Association and Authority. Then it was also handed down to the Veterans Administration and Veterans Affairs. And so here we see how redlining has been handed into several of our country's programs that were to enable Americans, all Americans. However, we see clear lines, clear facts that disenfranchise African American people. Redlining said that basically, if your home is near an African American individual, then that house is too risky. That loan will be too risky. These same guidelines were passed down in the underwriting process. So in the underwriting manual of the FHA, the Federal Housing Act, the Federal Housing Authority, these same rules and regulations were passed down. And so again, they said if it is within miles of African Americans, because we don't want them to freely walk into this neighborhood, these subdivisions either have to have a 6-foot cement wall, or these neighborhoods need to be separated by highways, by railroads. And for anyone, whether you're from a small town in Mississippi or whether you're from a large city, we know what it's like to be driving in one part of town and to cross one road, one highway, or one railroad, and the neighborhood, the tone immediately change. That's not because of African American people. That's because of laws that were put in place to disenfranchise this group. And so I'm going to stop right there. But again, this is going to be a wonderful series that's going to be talking about systemic racism, really laying the groundwork so that people can understand what it is. So then some of the rhetoric that's constantly being pushed can be addressed from a fact-based perspective. All right, so I definitely hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to comment. I have no problem. I will definitely respond to questions. This is about educating all groups, not just blacks, not just whites. This is about educating Americans, but not even Americans. We've seen with George Floyd how each state has consistently protested, but then we've even seen across the globe. People are tired of seeing black people being disenfranchised, African American people being disenfranchised. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you learned something today. Have a wonderful evening, and I look forward to responding to your comments and your questions. Thanks.